Bonjour, Eric Girard. It's great to have you here this year. Thank you for being there and attending this event. A few data points before we start, and I don't want to sound pessimistic here about Quebec's economy, but the outlook has been better. Quebec should end its fiscal year with one of the deepest deficits in Canada at $11 billion. Growth in Quebec in 2024 is expected to remain below 1%. I just talked about the deficit here, and at the beginning of 2024, it was much lower than that. Actually, $11 billion is $8 billion more than expected. What happened?
Okay, so first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. The Quebec economy is diversified and it is strong, and our public finances are solid. We have the most conservative definition of deficit in Canada. If you look at the traditional deficit definition, revenues minus expense, the deficit was $8.8 billion, 1.5% of GDP. BC was at 2, Ontario was at 1. It's more than we wanted. We're assuming our responsibility. We'll take care of it. We'll go back to balance within 5 years. Why did we have a larger deficit? 5 reasons. First of all, growth was slow. The Quebec economy in 2003 was almost stagnant. The monetary policy did bite. Second, interest rates were high and we're a large borrower. Third, people in New York City will remember that Quebec had very important forest fire in 2023. We had smoke all the way up to New York City. And this impacted not only the forest industry, but also hydroelectricity production. And this reduced our revenue from Hydro-Quebec by $1.5 billion in 23 and 24. And 2 more things that are more cyclical. First of all, we reduce personal income tax in order to protect the purchasing power of Quebecers. And this is probably the policy that prevented the stagnation from a recession in 2023. So good policy. Quebec citizens are highly taxed. We reduce personal income tax. And finally, there's nothing that we can achieve in healthcare and education without people. So we had to pay unions, public sector workers, 17.4% for the next 5 years. We have an agreement for the next 5 years, so we'll have stability in our expenses. And combine this extra expense for public sector employees, there was the population growth, which Stéphane just talked about, that raised the expenses significantly. When you forecast less than 1% growth in population and the actual population growth is around 2.6%, then you have more expenses.
But you still have recurring structural deficits of $4 billion until 2029. How do you manage that? You'll have to make some difficult decisions at what point?
Yeah, again, the $4 billion is after contributing more than $2 billion to the generation fund.
So that's a choice.
Yeah, but we're committed to reducing debt over time, going to 30% by 30% net debt to GDP. By 2037. So it's our choice to contribute to the Generation Fund. We're committed to the Generation Fund. We'll keep, but the size of the Quebec economy is $600 billion Canadian. So a deficit of $3 billion structural is 0.5% of GDP. So it's manageable. We recognize it. We have a clear plan. We'll go back to balance within 5 years. It's very important.
Where do you find money there, though?
Okay.
You need to cut on expenses.
So if you look, we take a lot of pride in our budgetary documents. If you look at the financial framework document, the pages, we try to answer the very important question. Do we have a revenue problem or do we have an expense problem? Where are we versus where we are before, where we were before the pandemic? And quite clearly, and what I'm going to say here is not very controversial, but it's quite clearly a lot of the expenses that we call temporary during COVID ended up being permanent. So we had to pay premium for employees in the healthcare sector. We had to keep PPE equipment. Now the pandemic is behind us, but these expenses remain. So our expense level with respect to GDP is higher than pre-pandemic, and that's where most of the effort will need to come from. in order for going back to balance within 5 years.
How do you find productivity within the public workforce? Maybe to get some synergies and more money out of it.
Oh, that's a very important point, because if you read The Economist, the Financial Times, you'll all hear that the private corporations are not investing enough and that Canada is not productive enough. And that's true, but the public sector is a very important part of the Canadian economy, and the public sector must be more productive. And so that's why we have reform in the healthcare sector. That's why we have reform. And the most important thing that a public government can do is invest in public education. And so we need to be more productive, especially in education, higher education, and healthcare. Transportation also.
To pay for this year's deficit, you went on a borrowing spree. You're issuing more than $36 billion of debt this fiscal year. Why are you laughing? Because I'm coming back to the deficit again, right?
I'm laughing at your term, a borrowing spree, but keep going.
There was no credit downgrade, but there was a warning from credit agencies.
There was no warning, but keep going.
Well, they said they had some concerns there.
There was no concern. Keep going.
Well, I can quote you an article that I wrote where we had, I think it was S&P.
But you're not a rating agency.
Okay, yeah, I'm not. Yeah. What do you say to investors to reassure them in the face of...
Okay, so first of all, our financing program is $30 billion on average. We're a frequent issuer. We have an 11-year weighted average maturity. We do 80% fixed, 20% variable, 75% domestic, 25% foreign. We swap everything back into Canadian dollar. And we like to be frequent issuer, at least have a curve. Initially, we like to do a 5 and a 10 in euro and in US. With respect to rating agencies, all of them, our outlook is stable. They've confirmed that our plan to reduce debt and going back to deficit is the right one, that this government is committed to doing so. And of course, the deficit of 1.5% of GDP is too much. We're going to take care of it. Of course, we have a large infrastructure plan because there are important needs. One of the things that is not talked about enough about population growth is the pressure it creates on infrastructure. We are building new schools for the population growth. We have healthcare demand related to this population growth. So we have a large infrastructure plan, and we will keep investing in our public infrastructure because we need to raise productivity. But that impose on us the responsibility of balancing the budget.
If there was an election today in Canada, odds are that the Conservatives would win the election and they would come in, and highly probable that they would slash the carbon sales tax. Quebec has its own sales tax, its own carbon tax. Where would that leave Quebecers if the rest of Canada doesn't have a carbon tax,
okay,
and Quebec has a carbon tax?
So we have a carbon exchange with California. Canada is an energy-producing country. We have responsibilities. We have responsibility today to reduce carbon emission. We have responsibilities for future generation. So Quebec intends to keep its carbon exchange with California, and we welcome any provinces or state that would like to join this exchange. And with respect to the carbon tax in Canada, I think the consumption carbon tax is really what everybody's talking about. And of course, it can be reform or improve or cancel according to the official position. But I think it's very important that we keep the industrial backstop. The objective of having a carbon tax on industrial emission, I think, needs to remain and is important for the competitiveness of Canada, for its long-term commitment to global warming.
And could Quebec remain competitive if there's no carbon tax in the rest of Canada?
Well, the point of an exchange is to make the reduction where it is marginally the most efficient. So that's why it would be more interesting if there were more states and provinces in the exchange.
The federal government decided to tax Canadian companies on 2/3 of their capital gains.
Yes.
up from half before June. You decided to match or harmonize the new federal rules, hoping to get as much, I think, as much as $3 billion over 5 years. I'm correct saying that. National Bank CEO completely disagrees with this, saying that it will hurt Canada's productivity in the long term, this new rule. Do you agree or disagree with this point of view?
Well, bank CEOs have a very important job, and they're not elected officials. And we just spent the first few minutes of this interview speaking about the importance of balancing budget and having long-term commitment to fiscal balance. The inclusion rate in Canada has always been between 50 and 75%. It's now going to be 66%. It's reasonable. The highest marginal personal income tax in Quebec or in Canada is at 53.3%. Dividend are taxed at 40%. And capital gains were at 26.5%, and now they're going to be closer to 35%. So overall, it's a reasonable policy to generate revenues. When you have an imbalance between revenues and expense, there's no easy choices. Some people can say that they don't want this tax to be increased, but I think they have the responsibility to suggest which other tax they would raise.
But could it impact the productivity on the long term?
I think investment decisions are not based on taxation. They're based on the economic potential, and Canada has fantastic potential. We're embedded with natural resource, with great universities, with human capital, and so they are great. We have access to, for Quebec, for example, we have access to 1.5 billion people market. So investment decisions are not based on the taxation rate at the end of a project. They may be influenced at the margin by this, but good project will still go ahead and should go ahead.
There's a lot of talks right now in Quebec about Nordvall, the Swedish EV battery maker. The company is facing a cash crunch right now. The word bankruptcy comes sometimes when we talk about Nordvall. There's a risk there. You promised to lend as much as $1.4 billion. Some of it could be converted into equity. Are you concerned right now? Could you hold the further disbursements? Could you put in more money?
Well, okay, so Quebec has critical mineral. We have nickel, we have magnesium, we have lithium, and so we want to transform these, and then we want to produce battery component. And Nordvall is at the end of the supply chain. So up to now, we have $16 billion of private investment committed. And the way it usually works is, and I'm going to do a generalization, every deal is different, but capital spending is subsidized in the order of 25% by the provincial government and 25% by the federal government. The private investor puts 50%. Okay? So Nordvall would be the largest private investment in the history of Quebec. It's a high potential project with some risk. We've recognized that when we went ahead. The disbursement are going to go as long as the project advances, and they're committed to their access. It's very important for them. It's their access to the North American market. They want to produce clean battery component with hydroelectricity. So they're committed to this project. The company is facing some challenges, and they're dealing with them, and we hope the project goes through.
Eric, you're responsible for bringing back the Nordiques in Quebec City. Some will say, if there are some Quebecers in the room, that not so many people are optimistic about this. What NHL's Commissioner Gary Bettman doesn't get here?
I wouldn't put the onus on Gary Bettman. I'd put the onus on private citizen or private corporation from Quebec. We have a fantastic infrastructure in Quebec City, a hockey arena that was built with public money, and it is built for Major League Hockey. And so we have the history, we have the fan, we have the infrastructure, we don't have the hockey team. Until we have the hockey team, we want to have world event like the World Juniors, the World Women's Championship. We want to have regular season game. We want to have preseason camps. And so what we need is a private corporation or the owner of a private corporation to come up with a business plan and a term sheet and to give that to Gary Bettman a bit and Bill Daly, a bit like Salt Lake City owners did. And once private money is committed to bringing a team back in Quebec City, when it will happen.
It's all about money. Thank you, Éric Girard. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup.